As we discussed in the last video, credit card companies make a lot of profit off of their consumers. So they're willing to basically pay consumers to use their credit card. Okay, basically, there's a certain amount of money to be made off of any given transaction, be it $2, for example. And credit cards basically would be willing to pay up to $2 to secure your business. And they have some different ways to do that. Okay, let's talk about the benefits that are related to credit card use. And we'll start with a term we mentioned earlier. Called a payment float. If you took me for personal finance, we discussed this topic in there and we actually did the calculations. I'm not going to worry about the calculations now. But basically, what a credit card allows you to do is it allows you to defer payments risk-free and interest-free. So if I make a payment today using cash, that payment occurs today for me. I spend that money today. That money is gone from my life today. But if I make a credit card purchase, it might be, say, 4 or 5 weeks before I actually have to withdraw from my, my checking account to make that payment. So since I defer my payments 4 or 5 weeks into the future, that gives me 4 or 5 weeks where I can take the extra money that I'm not spending and invest it, which will make me significantly wealthier over the course of a lifetime. The amount of money you can save there is actually pretty large. But that's not the only benefit. There's also cash back or other rewards. And this differs depending on the type of credit card that you see, but there are lots of different options. And chances are most people watching this video, when you get a little bit older, you're going to really care a lot about cashback credit cards. It's something you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about. And these rewards can pay out in a couple different ways. Some of them are literally just cash back. So for example, you might have a 2% cash back card, which is pretty much as good as they get. And that means that if you spend $100 on something, basically you get a 2% rebate on your purchases. So that reduces the cost of everything by 2% in your life, which is obviously a good deal. But it's not always cash back. A lot of times it's other rewards. And typically these other rewards are related to travel. So you might get airline miles. You might have points that are usable for hotels or rental cars. There's a lot of different cards out there. And we're going to talk about some of these directly in class. I'm actually going to go through and show you some examples of these types of cards. But these can be pretty lucrative at times, okay? And these are provided in 2 different ways, okay? So you might have cash back, you might have other rewards, and then they're also provided in 2 different ways. One is rewards per dollar spent. And that's what we've been discussing so far, such as a 2% cash back card. So you might have 2% cash back on every dollar you spend, or you might receive 1 frequent flyer mile for every dollar you spend on an airlines card, okay? But what's actually more lucrative to the person who really wants to maximize and optimize the value from these cards is something called a minimum spend bonus. And these are bonuses that give you rewards if you hit a particular threshold of spending, okay? A very common amount would be something like $4,000 over the first 3 months that you have the card. A lot of cards have something very similar to this. It could be a lot smaller. They don't get too much more expensive than this, but for whatever reason, this specific minimum spend bonus is really common. So if you spend at least $4,000 over your first 3 months, you might get something like 60,000 points or $500 cash back. And that is in addition to any of these other types of rewards you're getting per dollar. So you're not only going to get the minimum spend bonus, you're also going to get, say 1.5 or 2% back on your spending, which makes this a really good deal for consumers. Nonetheless, despite the fact that these benefits are very clearly favorable for consumers, there's a lot of debate over whether these credit cards actually help or hurt consumers in the long run. So let's do a little bit of thinking about how credit card rewards affect spending habits. And to do that, we actually need to discuss a couple of micro topics you have definitely seen before based on the prereqs for this course, but I just want to make sure that we remember how this content works. So first of all, let's do two reviews here. Let's start with this concept of consumer surplus. And you definitely should have seen this in Principles of Microeconomics, if not other courses. Consumer surplus is a measure of consumer well-being or happiness that is generated from consumption. And the logic to it is simply this. It's a pretty simple idea. The logic of it is that the consumer surplus for any given purchase you make is your willingness to pay minus the price that you actually have to pay, okay? And I think about this for myself a lot. There's some things that have very small consumer surplus. There's some things that have really big consumer surplus. So for me, internet. Let's think about having Wi-Fi at my house. How much would I be willing to pay to have internet at my house? In a given month, a lot, okay? I would probably be willing to pay maybe $500 for a month because I need it so much for work and I use it to stream TV and everything, you know. I use it a lot. So I would be willing to pay $500 for it, okay? In reality, I'm only paying about $60 a month. So my consumer surplus is $440 for internet, okay? That's the general idea behind consumer surplus, okay? But rather than thinking about it on just an individual unit of consumption, we like to think about it for a demand curve, and typically for a market. So we could think about just some random market. I don't know, maybe this is ice cream. And just put some values in here. Just to keep things nice and clean. And in the case of a market like this, if indeed the price is $4.25, so this market is operating at equilibrium, then the consumer surplus would be represented by this shape right here, okay? The logic is the demand curve represents the willingness to pay for some consumer, all right? There's some consumer that has a willingness to pay of that amount right there. And the amount that they actually have to pay is the $4.25. So the distance between those 2 points is their consumer surplus. Just like the $440 in that last example, that distance between those 2 points represents some individual's consumer surplus, okay? So if demand is linear, we can actually solve for this consumer surplus extremely easily, okay? Hopefully you remember that the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. So the consumer surplus for this market would be 1/2 times the base of this triangle, which is 100, times the height of this triangle, which is 7. And so we would get a consumer surplus of $350, okay? So in other words, the consumers are generating $350 worth of satisfaction, utility from these purchases. It's like they're $350 better off because this market exists. You take it away, they're $350 worse off without it, all right? So that's one concept we need to talk about, and that's about as far as we need to go with it. The other topic we need to briefly discuss, without a whole lot of detail, is the concept of elasticity. And we're focusing solely on demand here. So elasticity is basically a measure of how responsive consumers are to to a change in price. Now, you guys should remember elasticity and know that this is not the only definition. Elasticity can refer to a lot of different things. There's cross-price elasticity, income elasticity, supply, so forth, okay? What we're really talking about here is own price elasticity, if I wanted to be very exacting here, all right? What we're basically trying to figure out is how much do consumers change their behavior when the price changes, okay? So, if the price goes up 1% and consumers are very responsive to a change in price, then their quantity demanded would drop by a much larger amount. So a 1% increase in price causes a bigger change in quantity demanded. All right. In this case, we would call this elastic. All right. It's elastic. Mathematically, the logic of elasticity is that if you take the absolute value of the percentage change in quantity and you divide it by the percentage change in price, and then you take the absolute value of it, and we're just basically saying, look, one's going up, one's going down, but that's always going to be the case, so just ignore it, ignore the signs, all right? If you take the absolute value here, what you would get is 10 divided by 1, which is very elastic, okay? Basically, quantity changes 10 times more than the price. So, to be specific here, elasticity refers to the scenario where the elasticity comes out to greater than 1, okay? So we would call this elastic. The other option is inelastic. Inelastic is when the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price, again taking the absolute value. Maybe if price goes up 1%, consumers only change their quantity demanded by 0.25%. Well, in that case, you would get 0.25. And anytime the elasticity is less than 1, we call that inelastic. All right? I'm going through this quickly because all of you should have seen this. If you haven't seen this or you don't remember how it works, let me know and I can refer you to some practice problems or a book that provides a better explanation of this, because I'm really anticipating that everybody remembers this content. Thinking about the shape now of the demand curve, if demand is elastic, what that means is that the demand curve will be relatively flat, okay? Relatively flat. Connecting that to the mathematical concept, what that means is when the price changes by some amount, the quantity change is bigger in percentage terms, okay? So if the price goes up 1%, the quantity demanded drops by maybe 5%, all right? So the flatter the curve, the more elastic. Flatter, more elastic. And conversely, on the other side of the coin here, going to the opposite extreme, if demand is very steep, then that means a small change in price leads to an even smaller change in quantity here. So if price goes up by 1%, quantity changes by 1/3%, for example. So the steeper the demand curve is, the less elastic it is, or the more inelastic it is. And that is all the terminology we need to get through this next little lesson when we think about how credit cards play into consumption decisions. All right, so let's take the elasticity ideas we had, the consumer surplus ideas that we just learned about, and let's apply these now back to credit cards. This is kind of a novel little graph I'm about to show you. No big deal, but I kind of invented it. I'm going to send you guys the paper where I fleshed this out. But it's really quite simple, and it's basically just borrowing from regular demand curves. It's really nothing new, to be honest with you. But what we're basically thinking about here is all consumption that a person would make, okay? And we might think about this on like a monthly level. So this is like monthly total spending, which is a reasonable way to think about credit card spending since they are done in monthly increments, right? You typically pay your card off once a month. So this down here, we're going to label as the gross expenditure Normally, what we put on the x-axis for supply and demand graphs is the quantity. But in this case, what we're thinking of is the quantity of goods you buy measured by dollars, okay? So my total spending might be $3,000 a month, and that $3,000 a month is a representation of how much stuff I can buy. It's quantity, but measured in dollars, okay? So this is the gross expenditure in a month, measured by dollars, okay? Then on the y-axis up here, this is going to be the effective cost of $1 in purchases. How much does it cost to buy $1 worth of stuff, okay? The reason this makes sense is because if you use cash to buy something that costs $1, it costs $1. But if you use a credit card that offers a rewards-based system, it reduces the cost of a $1 purchase. So if you're using a 2% cash back card, a 1% item, a $1 item, costs you 98 cents to buy. Okay? So we can think about demand as being downward sloping, and this is demand for everything in a given month. Okay? We're thinking specifically about the items that you could use cash to buy, or you could use a credit card to buy. Okay? And we don't need a supply curve here because we're just thinking about this from the consumer standpoint. If they use cash, then the effective cost of $1 in purchases is $1. And that's going to be consistent throughout your quantity. In other words, every time you buy something that costs $1, it always costs you $1. Okay? So the marginal cost of spending is $1. Okay? And so this is like the marginal cost without a credit card. Now let's imagine that you have the option to get a 5% cash back card. Okay? A 5% cash back card would change the cost to you to 95 cents. So every time you buy something that is $1, it now costs you effectively 95 cents. So that reduces the marginal cost. And then we can think about how this will change the consumer's behavior. When they are using cash, this represents their total consumption. Okay? Their total gross expenditure with cash, which I'm just going to put GE1, gross expenditure 1, is represented by that amount there. Okay? But if they have a downward sloping demand curve and they are rational and they act the way we would normally expect people to act, then what happens is when you get the credit card, that causes you to increase your consumption to this level here, GE2. And depending on how flat or how steep the demand curve is, there could be a big gap between these amounts or a very small gap between these amounts. And this has really important implications on how credit card use will affect consumers. Specifically, if I get a credit card that has 5% cash back, is that going to help me save more or is it going to hurt my savings? Well, what we'll find out is that is actually dependent on how steep or how flat my demand curve is for goods. How elastic or inelastic my demand curve is. Okay? So we're going to definitely think about that. We're also going to think about the effects on consumer surplus, which is pretty easy, relatively easy here. If you use cash, then your consumer surplus would be represented by that triangle right there. Okay? Assuming demand is linear, which we will always make that assumption. Then this area up here represents my consumer surplus with cash. But as soon as I use a credit card, my consumer surplus now will be much larger. It will represent all of this area here. So what that means is my consumer surplus is going to grow and now incorporate this little shape right here, whatever that shape is. And so this is new consumer surplus when I use a credit card. All right? And so we need to think about how big this effect is. How much gains do consumer get? All right? We need to think about how much their consumption changes. And to do that, we're going to need to, of course, understand consumer surplus and also understand elasticity and how it plays in. Okay, so what you see in front of you here is the type of graph that you're likely to see on the quiz and on the exam. And there's a number of things that I need you to be able to do with this before we get into like the real analysis that we're going to do. I want to make sure we remember how to solve for elasticity. This is something you probably haven't done in quite a while. But there's something called the midpoint formula, which is really easy. You guys should be happy that I'm teaching you this because this should be a very easy question on the exam to solve for the midpoint formula. And the midpoint formula is a really good way to solve for elasticity, okay? Here is the logic of the midpoint formula, all right? Let's think about going from 5,000 to 5,200, okay? When you go from 5,000 to 5,200, you could solve for the percentage change, and you would do it like this. The percentage change would be 5,200 divided by 5,000 divided by 5,000 times 100. And that would be the percentage change when you go from 5,000 to 5,200, okay? If instead you went from 5,200 to 5,000, that would change the percentage change, okay? Simply put, in absolute value terms, you would still get 200 in the numerator, but since you're dropping from 5,200 to 5,000, the percentage change would be different, okay? In other words, if you're going from 5,000 to 5,200, you're going to get a larger percentage change than if you go from 5,200 to 5,000 in absolute value terms, okay? If none of that made sense to you, it doesn't matter. You just need to know the midpoint formula, which is a good way to think about percentage change because you'll get the same answer regardless of an increase or a decrease in value. And this is the midpoint formula. By the way, what we're solving for here is elasticity, okay? So if we're using the midpoint formula, the formula we'll use is the change in quantity divided by the average quantity. And all of that is divided by the change in price divided by the average price, okay? That's your formula. So it should be pretty easy to apply, all right? Now in this case, when we say quantity, we're referring down here to gross expenditure. That's the quantity of spending, the total amount of spending. And of course here, the effective cost will be our price, all right? So on a question like this, if I just give you this graph and I say solve for this person's elasticity between points A and B here, solve for the elasticity between A and B, what you would do is you would take the change in quantity, which is 200, divide it by the average quantity, the average of those two values, which is 5,100, okay? Then you're going to take the change in price, which is 0.05, and divide that by the average price, which is 0.975. Now here's the thing, I don't need to worry about signs, okay? You might be thinking, well, shouldn't this be a negative here, okay, since we're going to from A to B? Or perhaps this should be a negative. It doesn't matter, okay? This is absolute value that we're dealing with here, okay? So remember when we dealt with elasticity before, we said it's the absolute value. Same deal here, okay? So we don't need to worry about sign. Just report it as a positive number. And so we'll see what this comes out to. You guys can let me know if you get the same thing as me. If you want to check my math, I believe that should be 0.76, okay? So given that information, this is an inelastic demand curve, inelastic, okay? What that means is when the price changes, this consumer doesn't care that much about the price change. It doesn't affect their consumption that much, okay? They still care, but not as much as somebody who has an elastic demand curve, all right? So in other words, the percentage change here is smaller than the percentage change here, right? Quantity changes by a smaller percent than price. So in this scenario, scenario 1, the fact that it is inelastic is going to create a very predictable result. Okay, and we're going to see that bear out as we work through the math here. Okay, so some things we need to be able to solve for. Let's solve for their change in consumer surplus. That seems like a good first thing to solve for. Their change in consumer surplus is evidenced by this weird shape right here. Okay, and there are a couple different ways to solve for that shape, but I'm a simple man. I like to do things as simple as I can. And so what I do is I just recognize that I've got a rectangle and I've got a triangle. Okay, so I can solve for their consumer surplus pretty easily. And this is not their total surplus, but it's the change in. Okay, if they were using cash, their consumer surplus would be this triangle that we don't see the top of here. Okay, when they start using the credit card, you now add this bottom shape. So you include that top triangle, but it now adds this shape in there as well. So their change in consumer surplus would be the area of this rectangle, which is solved by base times height. So 5,000 is the base. Okay, this rectangle here is 5,000 units wide. So 5,000 times 0.05. All right, and by the way, they're using a 5% cash back card here. Hopefully that's obvious, right? It's 5% cheaper to use the credit card. And so their change in consumer surplus is $250. All right, and what that tells us is when you consider the stuff they were buying already, they're now saving 5%. So they're saving $250 by buying the same stuff that they bought before. That's what this rectangle tells us. Okay, let me say it one more time here. The rectangle is the consumer surplus they gain by buying the same stuff, but now they're saving $250 on that stuff that they're buying. Okay, so that's part of it. And then there's this little triangle here, which is solved by 1/2 times the base, which is 200, times the height, which is 0.05. And the area of that little triangle right there is $25. Okay? And that $25, no, that's not right, is it? That's way off. 100 times 0.05, that's just 5. Okay, there we go. So that $5 there, this is, again, the first 250 is because they're buying the same stuff cheaper. That's the $250 they save on those purchases. The $5 from the triangle is the extra consumer surplus they generate by buying new stuff, okay? They weren't buying this stuff before, but now they are. And they're generating $5 in happiness from those purchases. So their total change in consumer surplus here is $255. That's how much better they are as a result of this new spending that they're doing, okay? So that's one thing I can ask you to solve for. Another thing I'm going to ask you to solve for is, did they save money? And if so, how much? Okay, did they save money? And if so, how much? Well, let's figure out what they were spending without the credit card. We want to figure out if they switch to start using a credit card instead of cash, how much money do they save or how much extra do they spend? Okay, so when they had cash, their total spending was simply $5,000. They spent $5,000 and it was $1 every time they bought the goods, so we don't need to do any complicated math there, okay? Now with the credit card, they're now buying $5,200 worth of stuff, but they're saving 5% on each of those purchases, okay? So when you go to let's say you did all of this on Amazon in one day, okay? You go on Amazon, you spend $5,200. But in reality, you're going to get a 5% kickback on your cashback credit card that you're using, okay? So their total spending here would be $5,200 times the 0.95, which is $4,940. So what we can learn here is that this person increase their saving by $60 as a result of the credit card, okay? And what we will see, and will become more evident as you work through some of these examples, is when a person has an inelastic demand curve, then without exception, if the graphs in here that we're using make sense, without exception, if you have an inelastic demand curve, cashback cards increase savings. So on the surface, if you have an inelastic demand curve, that means that if you start using a cashback credit card, you will spend more money, you'll buy more stuff, but once you consider the benefit of the cashback card, you're going to save more money. And this might seem kind of trivial, it might not seem like it really is all that important, but $60 could be a lot of money to this consumer. And this is just for 1 month. And if we think about the US or the world in aggregate, a little change in saving to people's overall consumption could have major ramifications on tax revenues, the viability of Social Security, the need of Social Security, how much money is going into people's 401k, how many stocks they're buying. There are some pretty big implications to this, okay? So for people who have an inelastic demand curve, credit cards with a cashback reward will cause them to save more money. Now let's think about this second scenario here, okay? This person has the same credit card. They could use cash. This is the marginal cost without the credit card. If they use cash, it's $1. Every time they buy something that's $1, it costs them $1. Or they could use the 5% cashback card. And then they would save 5 cents on every dollar of spending there, okay? So let's think about how their situation would be different, okay? First of all, let's solve for their change in consumer surplus if they use the credit card, okay? Just like we saw before, if they use cash, their consumer surplus would be that triangle there. But if they use the credit card, they're going to gain this area down here. Hopefully the logic to that makes sense to you now. We've gone over it one time already. So we just need to solve for the area of this rectangle and then the area of that triangle. So we're going to do 0.05 times 5,000. Which is 250, okay? So the first part of this math comes out the same as the last example because this person was initially spending $5,000 just like the person in scenario 1. So they saved $250 on the consumption that they continue to do. But they changed their consumption more. This person cares more about a change in price. So it affects their behavior more when the effective cost goes down, okay? So the second part of this is the 1/2 base times height, which is 1/2 times 1,000. Trying to figure out that area of that triangle there. So it's a base of 1,000 times 0.05. And that comes out to $25. So first of all, what you'll note is that they get a bigger consumer surplus. Somebody's firing their gun very loudly. That is alarming. Okay. So what we can say from this is that when you are elastic, your spending goes up more than a person that is inelastic in terms of their demand. And the tempting thing to say, that the mistake that some people would say is, well, then this person's worse off. But actually, they're better off, okay? They're going to spend more. We will see that they will save less. But they are better off and they gain more from the credit card. In other words, people who care more about price should be more likely to use a cashback card because they care more about getting a 5% discount. All right? So they're going to spend more than an inelastic person. And also, their consumer surplus goes up more than an inelastic person. So the more elastic your demand is, the more flatter it is, the more flat your demand curve is, the more you're going to increase your spending when you get a cashback card, and the greater consumer surplus you'll gain from using that card. Now let's solve for their change in savings. So solving for their change in savings, we need to compare what they're spending now relative to what they would spend if they were using cash. Well, if they use cash, they spend $5,000, okay? And we don't know how much they're saving. They could be living off of $5,000, maybe spending it all. So we don't know how much they're earning, right? We just know how much they're spending. So we can't solve for their total savings, but we can solve for their change in savings. So we know they were spending $5,000 with the cash. Now, with the credit card, they're spending $6,000. They're buying $6,000 worth of stuff, but they're only paying 95% of that cost. So 6,000 times 0.95 will tell us how much they're spending. And this comes out to $5,700. Okay? So, in this case, when this person starts using the credit card, their savings actually go down $700. And indeed, this is what you'll see when you have an elastic demand curve. More elastic means a greater reduction in savings. So if we're going to think about how a cashback credit card would affect a person and their ability to save money, because that's often when we talk about this. From a banking perspective, we care about this. If you're a credit card company, we care about this. There's a lot of people that care. But I tend to think about this from a personal finance standpoint, which is, if I have somebody come to me and ask about cashback credit cards, and I'm trying to figure out if it's going to be something that harms their financial future, what I would like to do is get an idea about their demand curve, about their willingness to pay, okay? So in other words, if I'm talking to somebody and they ask about a cashback card, what I might do is I might ask them, well, let's imagine you had a 5% coupon on everything you purchase. Do you think you'd buy a lot of the same stuff or not? If they say, I think I'd still just keep buying the same stuff, then that suggests that their demand is very inelastic and their savings would go up. On the contrary, if I said, imagine I give you a 5% coupon and you tell me you would spend way more if you could get a 5% discount on everything. Well, that suggests to me you have an elastic demand curve like this and that your savings would actually go down. Now, that alone doesn't mean a credit card is a bad idea. This person mathematically is better off. Their consumer surplus rises. But when we think about the behavioral issues, maybe this person has the ability to get in their own way a little bit. Maybe their life would actually be better if they spent $5,000 and were able to save more money. But because of their myopicness, right? Their myopy, because they're more likely to focus on the short run, maybe that's what's driving them to spend so much more. Okay, so that shape of the demand curve gives us a big indicator of what happens when a person starts using a cashback card. That's the usefulness of this. So some takeaways regarding credit card spending. What we've really learned so far is that credit cards, specifically cashback credit cards, rewards style credit cards, increase consumer surplus. So they make everyone better off. It makes consumers better off at least. Okay? And that's assuming the graphs make sense, okay? We're going to talk about some alternative outcomes potentially with credit cards here in just a second. But if we just take the graphs verbatim, cashback credit cards make consumers better off. They increase their utility, okay? As a result of the not so surprising fact that cashback cards increase utility, the use of credit cards should increase because of the rewards. And that is theoretically good for the consumers because their consumer surplus goes up. It's theoretically good for companies like Chase or Visa or any of these payment processors. But this is bad for merchants, let's say, for the businesses that are selling goods and services. Because if people are using the credit cards more, then they get a lower share of the overall spending, okay? This is bad for merchants, particularly if consumers have inelastic demand. We could mathematically demonstrate this if we wanted to, but if people start using credit cards and basically they continue to do the same amount of spending that they would without the credit card, but now they're using credit cards instead, well, now businesses are going to lose out on revenues. If we go back to the last video, we think about, buying stuff at Blackbird Coffee. If you buy a small cup of coffee, it might, cost the business 7% of the revenues if you use a credit card instead of cash. So if people have inelastic demand, that basically means that they're buying not a whole lot more when they have cashback rewards. So from a business standpoint, this is just bad because you're selling roughly the same amount of products, but you're keeping less of the revenues due to the fact that credit card companies are taking their cut. Consumer saving could increase or decrease as a result of cashback credit cards. And specifically, we showed that if consumers have inelastic demand, then their savings would go up. And if they have elastic demand, then their savings would go down. And let's think about who these types of people would be, okay? If we're thinking about responsible people, responsible spenders, do you think they're more likely to have inelastic demand or elastic demand? Probably inelastic, okay? These are going to be the people that are more responsible. We might call these people natural savers, which is a term you hear sometimes in personal finance circles. The idea of a natural saver is this is the type of person that saves money easily. They don't have to try to save money. It just comes naturally, okay? And that makes sense for somebody with an inelastic demand to be a natural saver. What that means is when prices go down, they still pretty much buy the same stuff. They're not real sensitive to changes in prices. On the other hand, somebody with elastic demand, you can think of these potentially as being more irresponsible, as evidenced by the fact that they're really sensitive to a change in price. They don't have to be irresponsible, but it makes sense that this type of person would be more irresponsible, okay? If somebody really cares a lot about price, that means they're probably not a natural saver. They're the type of person who's very motivated by spending, okay? So the interesting problem is using a credit card causes some people to save less, and those may very well be the same type of person who has problems saving money. So indeed, credit card spending could be a problem for some consumers. And finally, to close things out, I want to talk just real quickly about other research on credit card spending. The research I've provided so far is my own research, and it's not empirical in nature, it's just theoretical, okay? We would really like to go in and test and try to see if these types of things are happening, but that's a really big study, and we'd have to get our hands on some really difficult data. So instead, I'm going to talk about what other research has found by actually looking at consumer habits. I'm not going to provide citations here, but I'm going to send you guys my paper, and it has the citations directly in the text if you want to refer to any of this work there, okay? So basically, other research has shown quite convincingly that the use of credit card leads to more spending. And there's no way to figure out exactly why this is happening, okay? One reason is because of credit card rewards, all right? And that's what we've been talking about so far, so that's what's not new to us, and that was my contribution to the literature here. So that's one possibility, is that credit card rewards cause people to spend more. But there's some other possibilities here. Credit card spending is less memorable. So some researchers have actually talked to consumers after their purchasing and everything, and basically consumers didn't remember their credit card purchases as well as their cash purchases. So they wouldn't think about their credit card purchases as much. So perhaps when people are thinking about spending money, maybe they're more likely to spend if they forget about their prior purchases. You know, if you forget that you bought something yesterday, maybe you feel like you have more leeway to spend today. So that's one possible reason why this could be happening. Another example, credit card spending. There's been shown that there is a greater focus on the benefit. I don't particularly remember exactly how this study was done, but essentially consumers, when they're buying something with a credit card, tend to talk about what's good about the product they're buying. Whereas when somebody uses cash, they're more likely to talk about the bad of having to pay for it, okay? So it seems like for whatever reason, credit card use causes people to disconnect from the spending a little bit and just think about the benefit of getting the good. And basically, just to give you a particular citation for this overall result, some data has actually shown that when credit cards are introduced relative to just cash, the willingness to pay doubled. And this was a study that looked at sports tickets. So like buying sports tickets on the secondary market using something like StubHub. When you allow people to use credit cards, the amount they were willing to pay, like in an auction for tickets, actually doubled. It's hard to know, again, why this is happening. The general theory that a lot of people have is it kind of feels like fake money when you're using a credit card. Casinos do this too. You know, you go to a casino, as soon as you get there, you turn your cash into chips. You turn your cash into little tickets, right? When you go to Disney World, you get the Disney World money. It's all about disconnecting you from the feel of making a purchase, okay? So for various potential reasons, what we do know is it appears that credit card spending ramps up when people switch from cash to credit cards. All right, so based on that, we know that credit card spending can be potentially problematic, okay? And this appears to be most dramatic when people are carrying a balance. There's something kind of like a self-control breakthrough. And just to explain the logic of this, let's say that with cash, I spend $2,000 a month. And I get a credit card, and it's not a cash back card, okay, so it doesn't reduce my cost. But let's say that with a credit card, I still spend $2,000 a month. Some researchers found that when people switched to credit cards in this particular study, it didn't really change their spending very much, unless they were unable to pay off their balance in full, okay? Or pay off their statement balance, to be more exact, okay? Remember, if you don't pay your statement balance, if you don't at least pay your statement balance, you then effectively have debt on your credit card and you will be charged interest. And what the researchers found was that people pretty much acted the same when they were being responsible and when they were working with their credit cards well. However, as soon as they carry a balance and are unable to pay the credit card off in full, well, then it's like they reached this point where they just said, the hell with it, and they ramped up their spending when they had a credit card. And this was in line with a lot of addictive behaviors, you know. Imagine an alcoholic who's gone 6 months without a beer. If the alcoholic drinks one beer, they're not going to stop there, right? They're going to drink a lot more. Kind of the same behavior here. This person's being responsible. They're adhering to, you know, controlling their demons here a little bit. But as soon as they reach a point where they've overdone it, they're going to go way overboard, okay? You skip a workout. You might skip a workout for a week. You procrastinate on one project. You end up procrastinating the entire day. You spend too much on your credit card where you can't pay it back, and then you just break through that self-control barrier and just start spending like crazy, okay? The thing about this is there's no way to do that with cash. You can only spend what you have when it comes to cash. So there's a concern that credit card spending will cause people to spend more, and indeed, a lot of research bears that out, okay? In total, credit card debt in the U.S. is about $1 trillion at the time that I'm teaching this, okay? And that comes out to about $2,900 per capita. And that is not per credit card user, that is not per adult, that is per capita, per population, okay? And that goes to show that this is a really meaningful problem. And it's totally important that we study these things to try to get a feel for it. All right, from a personal finance standpoint, I want you to recognize here that credit cards can be very damaging if you're not using them responsibly. So if you're thinking about getting a card, think about your elasticity. Think how likely you are to spend. If you find $100 on the ground, are you very likely to spend that money? Well, then you probably have very elastic demand. And indeed, using a credit card may cause you to spend more. You find $100 on the ground, you save it, that's indicative of someone with inelastic demand, meaning that using a cashback credit card might make more sense for you. Okay, well, that's the end of the topic on credit cards. We're getting close to the end of the semester here.